It's not very often we get to see Ainz express how he truly feels, but that's exactly what happened with Neia. He may not feel comfortable sharing his opinions with his subordinates, but with her we got a glimpse into his true intent, how he really feels about his rule over the Sorcerer Kingdom. This different view on Ainz doesn't just stop there though, as with even the paladins in general, his cleverness is put on full display too. Usually it'll get overshadowed by Demiurge and Albedo, but with both out of the picture, his input can go unobscured. Enough that you start to see how it is he managed being the leader of a top guild in Yggdrasil. So, that's two core aspects of Ainz we'll get to see in the cut content here. Everything from the carriage ride to the plans made in the Paladin's cave base. Let's get started. Part 7. The Plan. After having bowed his head twice to Neia while in the carriage, her reaction would have Ainz realize just how difficult it was to act as a king sometimes. He would straight up mumble, "This is hard," out loud, a statement Neia quickly misinterpreted as him referring to the challenge of having to open up to a foreigner. Ainz would recover himself by shifting the conversation, finally offering Neia the bow Ultimate Shooting Star Super. It was a gift Neia knew she had to refuse, but doing so only led Ainz to offer a replacement in the form of Great Bow Special. A less flashy substitute, still engraved with the magnificent power of runes of course. So, seeing refusing would only cause Ainz more hassle, Neia accepted the first bow and the powers that came with it. It's not mentioned whether it's placebo or not, but the moment she held the bow, she felt energy flow into her and her muscles strengthen. So, where before she thought the bow was just a fancy design with nothing on the inside, just holding it had proved otherwise. She quickly saw the powers within was enough to rival that of even the Paladin's holy swords. It was a valuable item she felt could only be described as super valuable. That's when Ainz would contradict that, mentioning this wasn't even the best he had. If she was looking for something with better performance, then she simply needed to let him know. It was a generous offer she knew she had to shut down quickly, since if at the end of the trip she ended up with gear better than the leader of the Sacred Kingdom herself, well, let's just say Remedios would have more than just a scolding in store for her. It's for this reason that Neia wanted to hide the bow and tuck it away somewhere, but Ainz's only condition for using it was that she had to tell others where she got it from. A request that involved showcasing the weapon to everyone. It was then that the conversation would go back to the original topic, Neia's opinion on the Sorcerer Kingdom. For her, since the kingdom was named after Ainz, she figured he liked being the center of attention. I mean, why else would he commission giant statues of himself? The most obvious reason was to make his power known to everyone everywhere. So, Neia figured complimenting that was the best idea now, comparing it to a different statue of a sea dragon. Where that one was only similar in scale though, Ainz's was far more detailed. For all who had seen it, it was the height of artistic construction. This wasn't enough for Ainz's subordinates though, as in addition to adding more of them all throughout the country, they also wanted to build an even taller one right in the center of town. This one would be 300 feet, approximately the same height as the Statue of Liberty. It was intended to tell the world just how great he was. For Ainz, the idea of it was simplistic though, since to him it wasn't material things that indicated a king's greatness. Such was a sentiment that instantly shot up Neia's respect for him even more. In fact, it was here in this moment that Neia finally understood Ainz was a real king. Something peculiar was noted out of the corner of her eye though, and that was the sight of Ainz clenching his fists. The movie kind of leaves it at that, but in the novel it goes on to explain why. You see, being a proper ruler clearly meant a lot to him. So, when he went on to explain this sentiment of his, he would mention how he didn't mind if being grand and plentiful let his subjects live in freedom and comfort. Like, if a display of power served the purpose of preventing other kingdoms from invading, then that was a feat he would perform any time of the day. When it came to a statue like this though, what purpose did it serve other than to show his own people his greatness? To him, it was a symbolic gesture that meant nothing. So, Ainz didn't want to be known as the king that projected his greatness onto his people, he wanted to be known as the king that let his people live in peace. That's when Neia would ask why it is he cared so much for them, a question to which Ainz would respond with one of his own. Wasn't it normal for any king to operate like that? I mean, it's not like caring for the people was something he thought about every moment of every day. It's just something that came naturally as the ruler of his kingdom. So, this whole answer was an unexpected response that led Neia to see that this was the true greatness of a king. She wondered if the Holy Queen and the nobles of the Holy Kingdom thought like that too, or perhaps this was just the product of an undead who lived forever. Perhaps his perspective was different since he could think much farther into the future. Either way, this whole conversation was actually quite revealing for Ainz. It's rather rare for him to open up in a way where he could speak frankly, but it was in this moment with Neia that he could about his role as the Sorcerer King. And clearly this position is more than just a means to an end for him. He's genuinely passionate about taking the role seriously. So, when something as unimportant as a 300-foot tall statue gets built, it's only natural he get frustrated since it goes against the ideals he truly stands for. That and people were sure to complain about it blocking the sun for them. He just can't do anything to oppose it since once his subordinates are set on something, it's tough to change their mind about it. All in all though, this carriage ride went to serve many purposes. Ainz's marketing for rune technology began, the seeds for Neia's cult-like obsession were planted, and Ainz was able to open up in a way we don't usually get to see. This brings us now to the Liberation Army's cave base, a repurposed monster lair the Paladins cleared out a while ago. They had created simple furniture using the trees in the surrounding area, partitioning the cave into rooms meant for different purposes. Reason being that among the 347 people seeking refuge in this cave, 189 were paladins, 71 were priests, and 87 were just common folk. Of course, this made space limited, so when it came time to create a room for the Sorcerer King, Ainz was forced to wait outside while others frantically moved furniture in an attempt to put something suitable together for him. It was while doing so that Ainz would mention his concern about their tracks, wondering if they were covering them as they traveled. Reason being that the trail of their caravan was so easily noticeable that anyone looking out for them could spot it instantly. It was from there that they could follow the paladins back to their hideout easily. Well, turns out the paladins hadn't been covering their tracks at all, so it was very unlikely the invaders didn't know where they were located. Why haven't they attacked yet then? Well, Ainz believed they were left alone on purpose. The most plausible explanation being that they didn't want to lose track of them. Say they attacked and some of the paladins escaped for a second time, not only would the demi-humans have to track them down again, but those who survived would likely learn to cover their tracks this time. That being the case, the demi-humans were likely waiting to wipe the paladins out in one fell swoop. An insightful assumption that, as you'd expect, left Neia astonished. Now, sometimes Neia would forget she was talking to an undead since everything about Ainz seemed to dictate otherwise. It was only when he'd mentioned things like not having to rest that she'd remember Ainz was who he was. Still, her preconception of undead was completely shattered by him. In fact, sometimes she thought it more believable that Ainz was just a human wearing a skull mask. It also didn't help that Ainz would often fan the flames of camaraderie between them, as sentences like "we're in this together" weren't uncommon. Neia knew he was simply referring to her kingdom and his, but to hear him say it directed at her was quite the thrill in and of itself. Now, it was once Ainz's room was ready and the two exited the carriage that anyone who saw Neia's bow were all shocked. It was the first time any of them were seeing it, so it made sense they'd be thrown back by a squire being in possession of it. The two would then go talk with Remedios, a walk through camp which unexpectedly resulted in quite a few eyebrows being raised. Many paladins even found themselves on guard, a gesture Neia thought to be rude. She knew the Sorcerer King was far too kind to get angry over that, but she was also well aware that the most kind people were often the most terrifying when upset. It's for that reason Neia felt she should have warned her people not to act the way they did, but changing their behavior wasn't something she could achieve overnight. No, this was, after all, their natural enemy. The most she could expect was for them to not draw their weapons at least. Shortly after was this peculiar moment with Ainz, one where while walking he would pull out a piece of paper and stare at it. Neia couldn't tell what was on it, but I imagine it was some sort of script or talking points for his meeting with Remedios. Either way, the ensuing meeting was far different from what we saw in the movie. So, After an introduction of Ainz to the others not part of the delegation, Ainz would have Neia explain the problem he mentioned about their tracks. This meant their base was exposed, and it was only a matter of time before Yaldabaoth would come to exterminate them. Remedios would immediately ask what it is they should do, a question Ainz refused to answer for her. Reason being that he wasn't here to take command for them. As a helper solely here to fight Yaldabaoth, too much leading on his end would only invite trouble after Yaldabaoth was defeated. That being the case, Ainz wanted to know what their plan was before suggesting his own. It's not like he was against taking charge himself, it's just if he did, not only would they have to accept the consequences which came after, they'd also have to accept the optimal way in which he planned to handle these things. They were methods which would surely contradict the values of the Paladins. Neia fully thought that was the best course of action, but Remedios had no intention of having another nation's leader be their commander. Instead, she would simply ask what Ainz would do here. An inquiry for reference and nothing more. Ainz's response would be to relocate as soon as possible, and if that wasn't possible, to operate under the assumption every move they make would lead Yaldabaoth to attack sooner. Those were the words of wisdom he would leave them with, giving them something to discuss while he went to his room. Neia would be left behind as his representative, stuck in a room with people who didn't respect Ainz for the king he was. They were all hesitant to treat him as such and even refused to refer to him as His Majesty. Most just believed this was a mistake, since to them all they were doing was chasing off one monster by inviting an even more terrible one in. At first, Neia was annoyed by this admittedly natural response from them, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized they just didn't understand him the same way that she did. She began to feel pity as none got to experience the true nobility that she did. To her, only she was given the opportunity to decide the Sorcerer King was truly a ruler worthy of their respect. It was then that a priest would inquire about Neia's bow, asking if he could examine it to make sure it wasn't enchanted with any harmful magic of sorts. Neia knew she should have handed it over, but their disrespect towards Ainz had her refuse. The way they just wanted to use him didn't sit right with her. It was a feeling that wouldn't allow her to hand over one of his precious possessions like that. Obviously, Remedios wasn't a fan of Neia talking back, but when Neia mentioned how she'd have to report back to Ainz of what they did, they quickly moved on as they knew it would get them in trouble. Remedios would then try to dismiss Neia back to Ainz, but even that wasn't allowed as Ainz had ordered her to stay here. If she was to go back to him with proper reports on what the Paladins' plans were, she definitely needed to stay longer and actually be present for that conversation. So, the planning would continue as is, revolving around where they could possibly relocate to. No one had any suggestions, and the only person that might have died on the wall alongside Orlando. Sure, any other ranger might have been able to provide an answer too, but right now their group had no one like that. Their only respite was that Yaldabaoth shouldn't attack as long as no moves were made, so that gave them the idea that they could just put the issue off. The thing is, supplies were limited and their people still suffering. They couldn't afford to just sit around doing nothing while they searched for another hideout. Food was a whole separate issue many felt needed to be addressed too, since, as of now, they only had enough to make it through the winter. There were two options available to solve this, but one was too expensive and the other unlikely. Like, they had tried to negotiate with wealthy merchants of the Riestes Kingdom, but the response from them was timid. Ideally, they would have moved their base to the coast and transported food via ship, but like I said, that was way out of their budget. That left relying on the south, an option even less likely than getting help from the Riestes Kingdom. If they were going to somehow use them, then they first needed to find a way to motivate them. So, their exposed base and dwindling food was one thing, while for Remedios she was still concerned about the Queen. Her meeting with the Blue Roses touched on the idea of resurrecting her, a notion they unfortunately said wasn't possible. Without the body and the damage being too severe, Tier 5 magic likely wouldn't work on her. So that's when the suggestion of borrowing Ainz's power would come up, an idea Remedios was clearly against, but didn't outright refuse as she and everyone else knew it was necessary. This, however, wasn't their main concern, as right now they needed to figure out how they were going to free the prisoners. Remember, with all the civilians being trained in combat, For every village they liberated, that was another addition to their military force. Of course, that also meant the food situation was only going to get worse, but Remedios countered by saying they were going to focus on the camps. To her, enemy outposts like that were sure to have food to support it. So, the plan was to liberate the prison camps one by one, use those additional forces to liberate more camps, steal resources to replenish their own, then in that process hopefully come across a noble who can put them in touch with the south. The idea was to amass an army to counter Yaldabaoth's before Yaldabaoth could mobilize his own. A kind of surprise counterattack Remedios hoped would throw their plans off. So, Neia would be sent to relay this to the Sorcerer King, only to be stopped and accompanied by Gustav. Neia had her suspicions as to why Gustav wanted to join her, but the excuse was that it was proper etiquette for a paladin to explain the operation. Either way, Neia knew she couldn't object to it. If it did turn out to be an assassination attempt though, then Neia resolved herself to defend against it. That was very unlikely though, but the fact he dismissed the paladin guarding Ainz's tent meant he was here for another purpose aside from explaining the plan to him. What was that purpose? Well, before we could find that out, Gustav and Neia would first find Ainz enjoying the luxury of a bed he created. This wasn't like any of the beds the paladins had, but was rather a fancy, magically created piece of furniture seemingly out of place in the dark and dreary tent he was given. It was certainly a surprise to see for Gustav, but not so much anymore for Neia. Ainz would then ask why Gustav had come here, a question to which he would say he felt it better to explain things himself. Such an answer clearly disappointed Ainz, since to suggest Neia wasn't capable of her job also implied he wasn't capable of judging people. It was an act that spoke poorly of his character, so much so that Ainz would actually say he was offended by it. This was quite the big deal since for the first time Ainz had shown some semblance of anger. No matter how they looked at him and how they acted towards him before, he always refrained from doing so. Neia, however, could tell that Ainz was upset here, and it warmed her heart to know it was over her. She truly felt special experiencing this feeling of being valued by someone. Gustav would then apologize and explain the plan, following it up with the reason for why he really came here. You see, he wanted to know what Ainz himself thought. He wanted to pick the king's brain and get advice from him. This is why he ordered the guard to leave, since it wouldn't look great seeking consultation from a foreign undead ruler. In fact, some might even consider it insubordination. Neia fully believed hiding it was silly though, since it was pretty clear nothing was going to get done without the Sorcerer King's strength. That being the case, she believed it was best to get ahead of all that. If the people were going to find out anyway, then she felt they should learn of Ainz's compassion as soon as possible. The main problem is she couldn't spread that word herself, at least not yet. If she started speaking of how amazing Ainz was right after their private carriage ride, then many would assume she was under the effect of a charm spell. So right now, Neia's biggest concern was figuring out how to get people to trust the Sorcerer King. She was fully invested in helping Ainz overcome all the preconceptions about him. This was what Neia was thinking as Gustav discussed the plan with Ainz, a more one-sided conversation as Ainz refused to participate. Since he mentioned how he wasn't going to give any more input before, even with Gustav begging, he was still determined not to. The main problem was that should his advice be taken and the plan fail anyway, all the responsibility would fall on him. Gustav still insisted anyway, desperate for anything to help them avoid failure by even just a little bit. Luckily, he didn't come unprepared, as by having this conversation in private, he could ensure anything mentioned would stay between the three of them. That way, even if his advice was taken, no one would know it came from him. This seemed rather satisfactory for Ainz, so as he began to add his own input to what the paladins came up with, the first issue he would mention was food. Yes, it was possible the prisoner camps would have some, but it definitely wasn't enough to properly sustain an army. In fact, it was more than likely the demi-humans weren't even feeding the prisoners properly. That's certainly the choice that Ainz would make, since even if the prisoners were freed, lack of nutrition would prevent them from fighting back. Ainz's second issue was equipment, since even if the prisoners were capable of fighting, it's not like the paladins had a whole bunch of spare weapons and armor laying around. They were hoping to get that equipment from the camps too. Obviously, it didn't take a genius to see relying on the camps for everything was a mistake, but realistically, the paladins didn't have much of a choice. It was clear their priority was to rescue the suffering prisoners. That much Ainz could agree with, but he insisted they at least have a plan for food ready. In an ideal world, getting the South to cooperate would be best. That, however, required the help of the royal family, and with the queen dead, that meant they needed a substitute. Surprisingly, Gustav would fully admit that the queen did die, also he could ask if something could be done about it. He wanted to know if it was possible to bring her back with his magic. Ainz immediately said it wasn't impossible, a nonchalant answer that shocked even Neia. You see, with resurrection being the essence of faith magic, there were only a small handful of people capable of casting it. That being the case, for Ainz to speak so casually of it meant that he must be one of them. In any case, the outcome of her resurrection relied on three main circumstances. Was the body readily available? Was it in a condition one might consider salvageable, and would there be compensation at the end of it? The former two Gustav unfortunately couldn't answer, but in terms of reward, Ainz was promised anything. The main problem of resurrecting without a corpse though is that even if Ainz did do it, she'd just end up as an undead. Yes, it was fully possible, but it definitely wasn't the outcome the paladins were hoping for. To do that would undoubtedly lead the kingdom into a war with itself. Ainz would then question whether the Holy Kingdom possessed casters capable of tier 5 spells, another question to which Gustav was unsure of. So, with resurrection not being an option anymore, the only other was to secure a different member of the royal family. If they were going to unite the South and get their help, freeing any of them from the prison camps was sure to do that. It's a plan we'll see them enact in the next cut content. That means we're finally going to get into some action, but I hope you've been enjoying all this character development as much as I have. It's pretty cool to see Ainz in a different type of spotlight. But anyway, if you liked the video then leave a like, and if you want to see more then consider subscribing. Feel free to check out some of my Lord of Mysteries content too. Until next time though, ciao!